Hello and welcome back to Let the Stones Speak. This is a podcast where we talk about the latest in biblical archaeology and also some really interesting studies comparing the Bible to what has been discovered in the past. For today's program, I recorded earlier an interview with one of our staff writers, Mr. Christopher Eames, about a topic that is seemingly on everybody's mind right now, or at least at this time of the year, if you're interested in the Bible and history and what was happening around the time of Passover, the days of unleavened bread. Surely you're interested in the Exodus, and surely you're interested in who is the Pharaoh, or who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And I interview Christopher Eames about this. He's written an article that's available online right now with that same name that goes through a lot of the details we discuss in the interview that can really help you out to cement in your mind the biblical events and the Egyptian events as well as recorded by their own writers, and check them out. Check the historicity of the Bible as in comparison to what the records of the pharaohs discuss. So please enjoy this interview with Christopher Eames. Thank you very much for joining us again, Chris.
It's a pleasure.
So when you decided to write on this, and I heard that you wanted to write on this, I was like, oh no, don't go there. So many people have been there. And as far as my understanding was, it was going to be impossible to get to a more probable or even definitive answer as to who is or who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. However, when I went through your article, Who Was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, I came away thinking that, well, it seems to be actually clearer, perhaps, than most people have been letting on. So thanks very much for writing this. Let's talk about the Pharaoh of the Exodus. There's been so many names that have been tossed out over the years. What was your approach to kind of give it a fresh look at this?
Okay, well, thank you, Brent, for having me on again here today. Like you say, this is a loaded question. There's so much that goes into this, and there's a good reason why we haven't had an article on this up to this point. And this is something I've been wanting to do, but gradually accumulating material over the years for. And then finally, as many of our listeners will know, it's the Passover, Pesach season in which a lot of these articles come out. So I thought it'd be a great time of year to finally put something out based on all this data that I've been collecting together. So when I went into this article, I had more of an open mind. I was actually, as you'll know, and from conversations I've had with you, I was sympathetic to perhaps another pharaoh. And like you say, there are so many different theories as to the subject, and I lay out some of the different names people have put forward in the start of the article, like a dozen different researchers proposing a dozen or more different pharaohs. And there's even an article in there by someone commenting on who was not the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Like that's an easier subject to get into. And that begs the question, why is it such a question? Like, is it evidence that it's a fabricated story, as many minimalist scholars would seek to dismiss it as? And like I go through in this article, there's actually several very good reasons for why the ambiguity of the Exodus Pharaoh, and I lay them out. Originally, this came out in magazine form. You can see it on our website, but it has several sidebars in addition to the article. And this is covered in one of those sidebars, several of the reasons as to why the ambiguity of the Exodus Pharaoh.
So you were able to kind of discern or get through some of the weeds that trip people up, perhaps the dating of when the biblical account of the Exodus would be, and they have to try and line up an Egyptian chronology with exactly that date, so this must be the guy. Right. So how do you kind of get through some of those difficulties in the chronology of both Egypt and then the biblical dating for the Exodus as well?
Okay, well, I think for this question we have to have a good chronological framework independently for Egypt and what's going on during this period, and a good chronological framework for the Bible. And what typically happens for this debate is people will have an interpretation of the Bible in mind and then apply the the Egyptian data to that, or an interpretation of the reverse. And so you have a lot of chronological revisionists on the far extreme, Velikovsky with his 600-year chronological adjustment of Egyptian chronology to match with the biblical account. You've got David Rohl as well. He's got some great research, but he as well would propose something like a 150-year, 200-year chronological revision. And so on the flip side, you have a lot of even Bible-believing scholars who will take the biblical data and sort of play with the numbers to make it fit with the Egyptian data. And from that's where a lot of the Ramesside proponents come from, who identify the Pharaoh of the Exodus as being most popularly Ramesses II, or one of the Rameses from the 13th century BCE onwards, and then apply that to the biblical text and try and rearrange some of the numbers. So what I put forward in this article is that we don't need to radically adjust the Egyptian chronology, and we don't need to radically adjust the biblical chronology. And actually we find a good synchronism between the two, but what's necessary is to perhaps step back from just a militant year-by-year conception of each of the, say, Egyptian dates, because chronology is a fickle thing. It's like you pick your researcher and he's going to have his own chronology. Now, when it comes to Egyptian chronology, there are two main chronologies that are followed. There's the high chronology and there's the low chronology. And as people will find out going through this article, I do have a preference for the high chronology, but even within that, you've got different varying theories based on sole regency, co-regency, various things like that. So I think what I wanted to do with this article was not get potentially tripped up by this really militant year by year, this had to be exactly when this happened, but look at the broad picture for this. Look at the broad picture of the biblical account, the broad picture of Egyptian history, and then gradually zoom in. And there is a sidebar in there more about dating specifics for people who are interested in that.
Yeah, this what we're talking about here on today's program is not going to be, people can't walk away from here. I don't want people to walk away from here saying, well, this is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, I heard it here, that's it. You need to go and read this article. You had so many revisions of this article. I think you probably wrote maybe 20,000 words to get around 5,000 or whatever this ended up being. So you've really trimmed it down into a digestible, understandable piece. And it made sense. It just cleared up a lot of questions in my mind of the different dynasties, the different Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. All those things are answered in this. Again, we'll leave a link to it in the show notes. Who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? So people can go and read that to get all the proof that you think might be lacking in some of the assertions that you make during this. The proof is there inside the article. Perhaps we might not be able to cover it all. So you kind of lay out the biblical dating for the Exodus to show that this Exodus has to take place sometime in the 15th century based on the biblical dates. This turfs out the most popular proponent or most popular choice in, let's say, popular culture, that of Ramses or someone from the Ramesses dynasty being the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So we just move him along. We don't even have to cover him too much. But let's go talk about the previous, or the Thutmose dynasty is the one that you're most interested in, the Pharaoh coming from this period. Why is that?
Well, this is primarily based on several biblical numbers that take us back to that time period. So pretty much universally, people put the Exodus within the New Kingdom period of Egypt. And you can think about that as from basically 1500 BCE to 1000. The dates are a little bit more specific, but it's basically the second half of the second millennium BCE. And that's divided further into three dynasties. You've got the 18th dynasty, or the Thutmose dynasty, and you've got the 19th and 20th dynasties, which are the Ramesside dynasties. And like you mentioned, Ramesside pharaohs. They begin from 1300, and those are popularly attributed to the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But the big biblical numbers consistently point to a 15th century Exodus during the Thutmose dynasty, the 18th dynasty. And chief among those is 1 Kings 6 verse 1, which talk about Solomon building the temple, universally recognized as during the 10th century BCE, nearly universally recognized as being 967 BCE specifically. We've got an article about that on the website for people who are interested. So that verse says that the Exodus happened 480 years, or in the 480th year, before that. So extrapolating back nearly 5 centuries takes us back to an Exodus quite clearly within the middle part of the 15th century BCE. Now, this isn't the only scripture. You can look at Judges 11. There's a timestamp given there in an event that happened around 1100 BCE, in which the judge Jephthah says that the people have been in the land 300 years. And that takes us back to 300 years added to 1100, takes us back to about 1400. And then add the 40 years of sojourn, takes us again consistently back to the middle part of the 15th century BCE, which would put us again squarely within the 18th dynasty, Thutmose dynasty. There are other scriptures, 1 Chronicles 5 to 6, the genealogies there point back to that time period, other scriptures besides. So I go into that in some detail in the article, and then also link to even more detailed articles that we've got about those things.
So you get the New Kingdom, you get the Thutmose dynasty, and then you, in this article, the way you lay it out is you kind of start after the Exodus and go through pharaohs working back towards somewhat close to the biblical date of when it would have happened. And then you get to the guy you think it is, and then you go backwards. We'll start further back in time and then go towards him. Let's cover this territory of time with the pharaohs that were after the Exodus, what was going on in the Bible, inside this Thutmose dynasty, going back to your main contender, and we can start with Akhenaten.
Okay, sure. So the way, like you say, that I set this up, I like to think of it as a Monet painting, just stepping back. Maybe some of the details are a bit blurry, but you see the full picture, and so that's what I want to do with these 18th dynasty pharaohs, to sort of step back, see them all in progression, see the general things that are happening, and then we can zoom in on some of the details, to see the forest first, and then to zoom in on the trees. So, like you say, I start with Akhenaten, and then go back through to what I believe is the Exodus Pharaoh, and then before getting into him, jump back even further based on the timeline of Moses' life, and then work back towards the Exodus Pharaoh, and then get into his life.
And I would say, just before you get to that, that if you already have a pharaoh in mind, keep listening. Because it's just good to look at this, I think, with a fresh perspective. Don't watch this video hoping that your pharaoh comes out top. Just have an open mind and see the evidence that you present.
Exactly. So I start with Akhenaten, fascinating pharaoh. It's during this pharaoh's reign that you witness a sea change in Egyptian religion to monotheism, the worship of Aten, or the sun god Aten, and in fact that's what his name means, Akhenaten, referring to this singular deity. Originally he was named Amenhotep IV, but changed his name to Akhenaten. And during his reign, okay, you've got the crazy, never before seen switch by this Egyptian pharaoh to monotheism. At the same time, you also get these amazing letters from Canaan called the Amarna letters. They were found within Akhenaten's administrative complex at Tel Amarna. There's something like nearly 400 of these letters, and many of them are from leaders in Canaan pleading with Akhenaten to help them, because there's this people called the Habiru who are overrunning the land. And like, you read some of these letters and the language is unequivocal. These kings of Canaan, they're writing to the Pharaoh saying, "Gone are all the lands of the king, help us, the Habiru are stronger than us, our cities are tossed like a wave upon the sea, were being completely overrun by the Habiru. And of course, at this time, and this is during the 14th century BCE, according to the High Chronology, during the first half of the 14th century BCE, and this fits with the time period of the Bible talking about the Hebrews coming into Canaan on the tail end of their sojourn. Again, more specifically around 1400, and then if you look at the biblical account, it all doesn't happen at once. It takes ultimately several decades for a lot of these battles and conquests to play out. And so you see an incredible parallel between what's going on in Canaan and what's written in the biblical account. And so, okay, if this matches up with Akhenaten as, say, the conquest pharaoh, and this matches up so well with the biblical time period, and we do have another article in the same magazine, by the way, and my article here links to it, about this question, are the Habiru the Hebrews of the biblical account?
And I think you lay out graphically in this article in a way that I've never seen before that people will just love. You know, you've got these places, these towns or cities in Canaan that are being overrun by the Habiru, writing to Akhenaten for help or something. And each one of these letters kind of has this geographic setting in which it's written. And, you know, they're doing this, or we made peace with them, or something is happening in the letter. And then you put it right next to the biblical account and what the Bible says of what the Israelites were doing under Joshua or someone at this same time. And the parallel, I think, when you all see it spread out on one page is surprising,
right.
I think. To most
Usually
people.
when you look at this question, people look at it as just in a general sense. Habiru kind of sounds like Hebrew, and maybe they're one and the same, and the time period is pretty similar. And you can make a fairly compelling case based on that. But what I do in that article is just go city by city, from the biblical account and through the Amarna letters account. And each city, there's like 15 cities in that article that I go through, and the parallel is exactly the same for what happened to that city in the biblical account and what is being described about happening to that city in the Amarna letters. So really, to me, you can't look at these and come away with, well, this is just coincidence. Right. It's too much of a parallel. So I start with that, with Pharaoh Akhenaten, and show that, okay, this matches up. And if he's the conquest pharaoh, then the pharaoh before him must be that pharaoh of the sojourn.
40-year period.
The 40-year period of Israel in the wilderness.
So who's that?
And that is Amenhotep III. And so actually these conquests, shall we say, start at the end or last part of the reign of Amenhotep III. And many scholars believe that Amenhotep III even set up this religious transformation that took place under Akhenaten. Some of the groundwork was set up for that transformation.
So we have Amenhotep III in power in Egypt while the Israelites have already left and they're doing their 40 years of wandering. So what connections can you put with the Israelites at that point in the stage of their journey and then this pharaoh?
Okay, well, Amenhotep III, he reigns for a very long time period, actually himself, I think almost 40 years, and he dates to the second part of the 15th century BCE, and he fits, again, well with that biblical chronology. And there are several tidbits that we can get from his reign that actually parallel remarkably well also. So this was a great statue builder, and there's something very unusual with actually a lot of statues that come out of his reign, and that's 600 of them. Some 600 statues are of the goddess Sekhmet, and she is a goddess of healing. So okay, well, what's this all about? A goddess of healing rising on the scene, being venerated, and then, like we've just mentioned, there's this ultimate collapse in the Egyptian polytheism, their religious scene, to monotheism. Okay, what's going on here in the religious sphere of Egypt and what is causing this? And obviously, following the biblical account, your mind goes to the biblical account of the plagues against, as the Bible says, all the gods of Egypt.
Right.
And a loss of faith in the gods of Egypt. And actually, one of Akhenaten's inscriptions say that very thing. He talks about how on one of his pylon inscriptions that he's witnessed how all the gods have disappeared, or all the gods have faded or died, but there is one God that remains, and who can tell his coming or going? It's actually quite moving. But you see the seeds for that transformation really start to flourish during the reign of Amenhotep III. And there's something else very interesting about this pharaoh, and it's from a temple that was discovered at Soleb, further south in ancient Egypt. And this is the Soleb inscription of Yahweh, or the Shasu of Yahweh. It's a pylon, another pylon inscription that mentions the Shasu, or nomads, of Yahweh. And it doesn't mention anything more than that. We can determine that it's referring to a people somewhere out to the east, based on the way these pylons are oriented and referring to various peoples. So somewhere out to the east, during the reign of Amenhotep III, we see nomads of Yahweh. And this is the earliest reference to Yahweh in the archaeological record. And this is another peculiar feature. Like, okay, well, the biblical account during the same time period talks about Yahweh worshipping nomads. And what's also doubly interesting here is that there was an article from Haaretz a while ago talking about evidence against the Exodus, and how one of the points of evidence was we don't find evidence of Yahweh worshipping slaves in Egypt. Well, that's exactly what the Bible says. I think it's Exodus 6 that God tells Moses that his name is Yahweh, but by this name was I not known by them. Right to that point, right to that very end point, just before the Exodus. So now all of a sudden we see the name Yahweh appearing, and associated with nomads no less, during that reign of Amenhotep III, which fits so perfectly before that conquest period, before Akhenaten, and fits with this biblical account of the Israelite sojourn.
All right, so we're still going backwards towards the actual Pharaoh of the Exodus. We've two down. Who's next?
Okay, the father of Amenhotep III was Thutmose IV. So he reigned for a very short period of time, less than a decade, and not much is known about him except for an amazing inscription from the start of his reign. This is a big basalt stela that was discovered between the pores of the Great Sphinx of Giza, and this is called the Dream Stela. And it's just an amazing inscription that, in short, is a divine recognition of Thutmose IV's right to reign on the throne. And like numerous scholars have pointed out, this justification was necessary because Thutmose IV wasn't the firstborn. Okay. He wasn't the designated heir to the throne. And so in order to sort of, I guess, placate the people, he needed to have this declaration of, well, the gods wanted me on the throne, and that's why I came to the throne. So there's a whole lot of debate about why he came to the throne as a younger son. There's some speculation that he perhaps murdered his way to the throne, but this, of course, brings with it its own difficulties, because this is a familial throne, and you don't just get away with murder so easily. So there are various difficulties with that interpretation, but of course, with pairing it, as we have done with the rest of with these other pharaohs, pairing it with the biblical account, what do we see of this successive individual to the Exodus pharaoh? That he wasn't a firstborn. Right. That the pharaoh of the Exodus, his firstborn died during the 10th plague, during the death of the firstborn. And so, again, we have this perfect fit that, okay, this short-lived reign of this individual, again, from the second half of the 15th century BCE, that his reign is really marked as one of a non-firstborn pharaoh and justified as such from the beginning of his reign. It really fits perfectly with the biblical account there as well.
So I guess then, looking at that, that you've kind of given away who you believe the Pharaoh of the Exodus is, it has to be Thutmose IV's father. Who was he? And perhaps to not make this a 3-hour episode, can you give us some more parallels between his father and the biblical text as well that show that he is most likely the Pharaoh of the Exodus?
Okay, sure. Well, the death of the firstborn plague, it talks about all the firstborn in Egypt dying. It talks about the firstborn of the Pharaoh dying, and so this fits well with the successive Pharaoh not being a firstborn.
Mm-hmm.
But we also find from the biblical account that the Pharaoh himself of the Exodus survives this event and goes on and sends his forces against the Israelites to the Red Sea. And so the inference then is that, well, this Pharaoh himself of the Exodus mustn't have been a firstborn. And that's the case with the father of Thutmose IV as well. And this is famously Pharaoh Amenhotep II. And so he is the one I identify in this article as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He's also quite popularly identified by Bible literalists who again point to these numbers in the biblical text and how they line up in their own various ways. In their own various articles, they bring this out. With some variations to the theory, but they also identify him quite popularly as Pharaoh of the Exodus. So, again, fitting with the high chronology, his reign dates to the middle part of the 15th century BCE, starting before then and continuing on, depending on how you view the chronology, through generally that middle part of the 15th century BCE, for about a 26-year period. And his reign gets going with a bang. Mm-hmm. This is an individual on track to be the greatest pharaoh of all time. Now, his father was Thutmose III, who reigned for a good block of time through the first half of the 15th century BCE. And Thutmose III is arguably known as the greatest pharaoh of all time. It's arguable, it's likely that he was the greatest pharaoh of all time. Certainly he was the greatest conqueror of all time, and he's sometimes called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. Conquered territories out to the east, really expanded Egypt's borders, was really a powerful pharaoh who took over from a co-regency with his mother, Hatshepsut, during the first part of his reign when he was too young to rule. And so his reign, Thutmose III, really fits well with the pharaoh of the oppression and also the pharaoh during the time that Moses was in Midian. And there's a sense in the first chapters of Exodus, based on the many days that Moses was in Midian, that this is a reference to Thutmose III because he had a really long reign in and of himself, and a really powerful reign in and of himself. Now, I mentioned that his he had a co-regency with Hatshepsut, the famous female pharaoh. Actually, that wasn't his mother, that was his stepmother. And she, as I bring out in this article, is another good fit with the pharaoh's daughter of the biblical account. And there's several points that indicate that, based on the nature of her reign, based on the fact that she didn't produce a male heir herself, and so that would have provided extra impetus to adopt someone like Moses, as described in the biblical account. There are unusual inscriptions that are from her reign that talk about her as the daughter of the pharaoh, because she was the fully royal daughter of her father, whereas Thutmose, through his father, was a half-royal pharaoh. So she constantly refers to herself as the daughter of the pharaoh in that sense as well. And she also talks about, in her inscriptions, having a heart toward the foreign people. Like, this is a really weird statement to hear from a pharaoh, but it fits perfectly well with the biblical account of this pharaoh's daughter who had a heart toward Moses when she found him. And so this is another one that parallels nicely, I think, with the biblical account and with Moses growing up in the Egyptian court under her protection, shall we say. And then during the sole reign of Thutmose III, that would be a good fit with Moses being cast out and spending time in Midian, and also with the Israelites crying out for help related to that penultimate pharaoh. Because again, Thutmose III was arguably the greatest pharaoh of Egypt of all time, and so it makes sense that the pharaoh of the Exodus wasn't the greatest pharaoh,
right,
but actually the one before him that led up to his reign. And so with Amenhotep II coming on the scene, possibly after a brief co-regency with Thutmose III, there's some debate about that, but with him coming on the scene, he really takes the ball and runs with it. He has some amazing and successful campaigns in years 3, 7, and 9 of Amenhotep II's reign. Incredible campaigns out east into Canaan. His year 9 campaign, he takes purportedly 101,000 slaves. Like, this is never before seen number of slaves, and it points to the power of his reign and the meteoric rise that he was ascending to in his reign. And there's a great study of this pharaoh by the scholar Peter de Manuelian, and I base a lot of the content for this article from this book. Very scholarly book, doesn't mention anything related to the biblical account, but you just peel through it, and there's so many layers that fit with Amenhotep II as pharaoh of the Exodus. And what de Manuelian points out is the particular cruelty of Amenhotep II, and just some shocking things that he did during his reign. Some examples are digging huge pits, filling them with prisoners, setting them on fire, capturing foreign kings, hanging them upside down from his vessel and transporting them back to his palace, and then tacking them to the walls of his palaces, cutting off their hands, just brutal, brutal stuff. And de Manuelian writes that, that it was natural to have some sense of cruelty for all these pharaohs, but Amenhotep II takes it to new heights, like heights that aren't seen for these other pharaohs. And so this as well fits well with the biblical account of the pharaoh of the Exodus having that hardened heart,
right,
particularly being highlighted for that hardened heart. Now, what's really interesting about that 26-year block of reign for Amenhotep II is that you have just this boom, 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 consistent series of campaigns, year 3, year 7, year 9, and then everything stops. It's like the last half of his reign goes missing. Okay, why is this the case? And you read some of the writings of de Manuelian, some of the classic writings of Sir Flinders Petrie, back in the earlier part of the 20th century, and they just comment on how they can't comment on any of the nature of the rest of Amenhotep II's reign, because it's like it's missing. We don't have good remains, and the remains that we do find are in the state of chaos or destruction. And this is another point relating back to the identification of Hatshepsut as the one who raised Moses, because a lot of her monuments are destroyed, and her name is erased, and her monuments are rewritten in various different texts. And this practice of damnatio memoriae, or destruction of memory, excision of memory, most scholars do attribute this to the reign of Amenhotep II. And so here's another thing. Okay, why is he, Hatshepsut was arguably one of the great pharaohs of her time, great period of peace during her reign. Why is he excising her monuments and destroying a lot of them? What led to that? But yet again, paralleling it with the biblical account, you can see a reason for that. If she had such a fundamental part in raising Moses and bringing him into the Egyptian palace, you would understand from that perspective Amenhotep II's desire to take out her record, or any record of that going on. Now, something we do see emerge from the very end of Amenhotep II's reign is a year 23 stealer to his viceroy in Nubia, Usersetet, and it's referred to as the Semna stealer of Usersetet. And It basically is warning Usertset of the people, the foreigners that he's ruling over, and it tells him to beware of their magicians. Don't trust them. There's these people of the Levant, they're crazy, I hate them, I'm paraphrasing of course, but just a strange stealer, and many have commented on the strange nature of it. And this as well fits the biblical account, because just the magician part in particular, you have during the series of plagues, you have the Egyptian magicians utterly failing before Moses and Aaron, and what they would see as the Israelite magicians, and the miracles though that were performed through Moses and Aaron. So you keep seeing these piecemeal things that keep pointing to the same conclusion in the biblical account. And okay, you can debate about exactly where in Amenhotep II's reign that the Exodus happened. Some put it in year 9, some put it in year 10. I talk about my preference in the article for that question. But again, I just want to step back from all those minutiae, and there's some latitude there to debate about this or that regarding dating. And just step back and say, hey, let's look at the broad picture. Boom, 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 one after the other. You can see that the pharaohs fit amazingly well with the biblical account all the way through, right up to the conquest period and the reign of Akhenaten and the ultimate collapse of that Egyptian religious melee that we see so classic of ancient Egypt.
So you've given us a good bit of a backgrounder to this, and definitely I think people should go ahead and read this article, Who Was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? It's online now. It's also featured in our magazine, latest edition, Let the Stones Speak. So definitely I'll leave a link for that in the show notes. Thanks for taking the time to go through all the weeds and present a really sound, logical case for the Pharaoh of the Exodus that matches so well with the Bible, which doesn't need a radical revision of Egyptian chronology that can just stand on itself if looking at all these succession of kings. If you look at that pattern of evidence as it become more famous, this way of deducing the past or looking at the past, you see the Bible and each of these pharaohs fitting into that chronology over a space of 150 years. So thanks very much, Chris, for writing the article and for coming on to the show for us.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much for taking time to listen to the interview all the way to the end. Thanks very much to Chris for coming on our show as well. If you'd like to read that article, go online right now to armstronginstitute.org. You can see in the show notes, I'll give you a direct link to that if you just scroll down from wherever you're watching or listening to this to get to that article. I'd also like to welcome you to become a subscriber of the magazine, Let the Stones Speak. This is a free magazine. It comes out 6 times per year. We'll send it to you wherever you are in the world. We'll never follow up with any type of request for money off you. This is done in the public service, so you'll want to get your hands on a hard copy of the magazine. It comes with all the beautiful graphics that our art department put together as well. So it's nice to read it online and get it immediately, but we'd also love to send you a free subscription to the magazine as well. If you want to subscribe, simply go to the website, armstronginstitute.org, scroll down to where you see the magazine offered and just put in your details there. Or you can write an email to letters@armstronginstitute.org and just simply request the magazine with your address wherever you are in the world, and we'll make sure you get a copy. Thanks very much for joining us today.